I've got the right one. Great. So let's talk a moment here about why we are all here. Certainly, as you guys registered for the webinar, you had specific questions in mind as it related to what you hope to gain from this discussion about marketing channels. Many of you may not have ever heard of marketing channels. You're not familiar with what they are. You're just here to learn more. We're happy to address those questions for you as well. Others of you may have heard of them. You may feel that you're using other marketing channel reporting via Adobe Reports and Analytics that aren't specifically marketing channels, want to know a little bit more about what you're using and why marketing channels may be of value to you. And there are those of you who are using marketing channels. Maybe you've implemented them. You feel that they are not quite working how you would expect them to, or you'd like to improve them. We'll also cover off those examples. So we really, our goal here is to make sure that you can leave this webinar and implement fully marketing channels by end of week.
We're sorry, we're having some audio technical difficulties. For some reason, I think Aaron and Brent have hung up on us. Aaron and Brent will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Is that better? Is that better? Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
You are back. We can hear you again, yep.
Okay. Apologize for the audio troubles. So we'll back up to the agenda. Again, what we hope to cover here and what we expect to cover is to initially take a step back and talk about channel reporting, generally speaking, level set on what we're talking about as we refer to marketing channels and how marketing channels fits within that reporting paradigm. We'll talk about the evolution of channel reporting. Many of you may be using, as I mentioned, different reports for reporting on marketing channels, and we want to talk about why those exist and the benefits and drawbacks of each. Then we'll take a look at, kind of start with the end, read the last chapter first, and look at what you get. Right, at the end of the day, why do I want to go through the trouble of setting these up? What am I going to get, and how is that going to help my reporting? And then we'll dive into, and we'll have Brent walk us through the marketing channel setup. We'll talk about tips and tricks and gotchas of individual channels and the most common ones, and how you might be able to optimize those to get the reporting as you'd like it. So let's take a step back then and talk about channel reporting initially. When we talk about channels, what we're really talking about are how visitors get to our site. This image kind of depicts a main line. We have many channels or pipes feeding into that main line, and that is similar to what we're talking about in marketing channels. How their visitors arrive at our web properties. So we each track many web properties. We may have different marketing efforts that drive those visitors. Things like paid search, natural search, other paid initiatives like email, display ads, affiliates, social networks. Those are just a few of the channels as we describe them. There are many others. We'll talk about them, the importance of them. But much like this plumbing example, if we think about plumbing a house or a building, there are really two key concepts that we want to keep in mind. First of all, we want to make sure that we don't cross channels, right? If we're plumbing for drinking water, we want to make sure we don't mix that up with sewage lines, right? We got to keep the integrity of the channels in place. We're going to talk a lot about how do we specifically identify these channels, how do we make them very solid in terms of their performance and keep the water pure. The other concept that we want to keep in mind as well is that concept of leaking, right? plumbing, the disaster is leaking. We want to make sure that we don't have water in places that we don't want it. Just like marketing channels, we want to make sure that there are no visitors that fall through that are not identified as associated with some channel. You may see that in a lot of your reports. See no channel identified, see none in some of your reporting, and that's what we're really trying to avoid. So as we talk about how to set these marketing channels up, as we go through and have this discussion, think about your own business, think about the channels that you work with, and how you might keep in mind this concept of completeness, where we're identifying everything and making sure that we've got great channels in place. Once we have that foundation in place, then that enables us to do with a lot of foundational reporting within Adobe Reports and Analytics. It allows us to measure the effectiveness of our campaigns or our marketing efforts. It allows us to improve how we're investing in the various channels, maybe move funds to other channels that are overperforming and away from underperformers, or help us optimize our channels. And then perhaps even using some of the other solutions, target or optimize experiences based on channel attributes or visitors that are identified as certain channels. So that's kind of the lay of the land and what we're talking about when we're talking marketing channels. So let's jump into a quick evolution of marketing channels. How did we get here, and what do you have available today? So as many of you know, we do have traffic sources reports. Traffic sources reports are found on the left nav under traffic sources, and typically will contain reports for search engines and for search keywords. There is some breakout for all, some paid and natural search keywords, search engines. The issue that we have with these reportings is that it is only search. It does not allow us to have this holistic view of our channels. It doesn't give us the opportunity to evaluate our channels side by side. Right, the search would always get credit for driving traffic, even though perhaps later in a visit, a visitor came back through a different channel, like an affiliate or whatnot. So it doesn't give us this holistic view of all of our channels. We then have campaign tracking as kind of another set of reports that you're all familiar with. Typically in reports and analytics, that's going to be the s.campaign variable or the tracking code report that is found in the campaign menu. It's been highly utilized and still very valuable, but it's largely driven by tracking codes, which we'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, we're talking about paid or identified channels. Again, it's not holistic. We don't have a view into natural search. We don't have a view into referring domains and other channels that are important to track as well. So again, not holistic. There was also a large emphasis on classifications. So along with this methodology of tracking, there was a lot of overhead in managing classifications and making sure that we can roll those up into actionable aggregation levels. Before we move on, let's take a quick break and talk just a little bit about campaign tracking or tracking codes in this context, because this becomes vital and important to how we look at and build our rules of marketing channels as we'll go through. So just so we're on the same page, when we're talking about campaign tracking and we're talking about tracking codes, typically we'd have a visitor who clicks an ad off-site, brings us to the site that we're tracking, and in the URL we have what we call a query string identified by the question mark, and then essentially amounts to name value pairs that follow. If we look at this example, CID is what we often refer to as the parameter. So this becomes an element which we can key off of in our business rules and marketing channels. So it's important to know when we refer to parameter, we're talking about the name and the name value pair. The tracking code becomes the value. And then we have many customers that create some sort of syntax around their tracking code and maybe have prefixes. In this example, we have DSP, might represent display in this regard, and that becomes an element that we can key off as well. So it's important to understand how we're grabbing these values, where they show up in the URL, and what the components are of the query string. So back to the evolution here that we were talking about. As we discussed both traffic sources and campaign tracking, the main issue there was that we did not have a holistic view of all of our channels. And so as we were working with customers over time, we employed the help of our engineering services team and came up with this concept of a unified source visitor rule. For those of you who don't know what Vista is essentially an environment within our data collection environment that allows us to apply custom code to manipulate and change the data prior to processing. And so what we were able to do is leverage this environment to create some logic that would create a more unified view of all tracking or traffic sources. Things like natural search. We would identify natural search and create a tracking code of sorts for them, put that into a variable, and then compare that against paid search and other paid initiatives. So while this gave us a holistic view of our reporting, it did come at a cost. This, as many of you know, is done through engineering services, which is a consulting engagement, if you will. It's very custom. Once they deploy or write and test and deploy the code, it's invisible to you as source. You can't see the source code. So over time, as maybe you have turnover in your organization, that knowledge leaves about what's happening. You don't really have an ability to go back and see what that code is exactly doing, and would require updates then. So as things change, the environment changes, the channels that you're interacting with change, you would need to, again, employ the services of a consulting organization at a cost to update and accommodate those changes in your environment. So it became very, very expensive and hard to manage. One case in point is late 2011, early 2012, Google made some changes to their encrypted search in that they began to hide from the refer string the keyword, which we use extensively in our search detection. And so that became a problem for many customers who had used the Unified Source Vista rule, in that search traffic was wrongly identified as non-search and perhaps referring domains and other channels. So it creates, again, a situation that you have to manually update those rules and try and keep up with the changes. It's very expensive. We had, just after that, a channel manager plugin. Some of you may know that. It wasn't quite as adopted, but essentially the JavaScript equivalent to Unified Sources. While, again, it gave a holistic view, it added weight to the JavaScript. It requires IT resources to make updates. So there's some timeline in making updates and adapting to changes. But it did give you a little more visibility into what exactly was happening. So that was kind of the history of how we got to marketing channels, and eventually learning from each of these situations, we worked with product and developed marketing channels, added that as a report base inside the product itself. Gives a holistic view of reports, but puts the control in your hands. It gives you an environment to create rules, to change rules as things change. There's no additional cost for it, and it leverages the list and the work that we do from a product standpoint. We manage lists of search engines and continually update those, so those are automatically updated for you. So a lot of benefits. Again, it's free, and really no reason not to leverage that, even side by side to some of these other solutions. So if you came today kind of knowing that you use different reports, you're wondering how they all fit together, this is kind of the evolution. This is how we got to where we're at, and ultimately would encourage you to investigate marketing channels if you haven't, given some of the flexibility and the control that you have. It's important to quickly note where marketing channel sits in kind of the data collection environment. There's some dependencies to be aware of. So as data is sent in from your web pages to our data collection environment, we first run processing rules against that data. Processing rules, if you're not familiar with what processing rules are, they exist in the V15, in the kind of SiteCatalyst 15 environment, and allow you to build business rules as an admin and apply those changes at data collection time. Have many Vista-like functionality where you can manipulate, concatenate, change casing and whatnot of variables passed in via JavaScript. Following processing rules, Vista rules get applied. Again, we spoke about this in the context of Unified Source Vista rules, so they can, again, manipulate the data and make changes to the data that's been passed in. And then finally, we get to marketing channels. So the takeaway here, and what's important to note, is that as you think about building your marketing channels rules, understand that processing rules and Vista rules have already taken hold on that data. If, for example, you build a marketing channels rule that keys off of the tracking code, for example. Maybe you're looking for a certain prefix EM : on a tracking code, and you have a processing rule in place that concatenates tracking code with some other value. You may have messed up that rule or that value, so by the time it gets to marketing channels, that doesn't exist, and you're not seeing your email rule take hold. So be very aware of any Vista rules or processing rules you have in place and how those might affect your marketing channels. We'll talk a little bit about best practices of how to create rules so that we can kind of avoid some of those situations, but keep that in mind certainly. Great, so before we jump into how to create these rules, how to set them up, and the best practices, let's just talk a little bit about what you get. At the end of the day, what am I going to get going through this effort? What you see on screen right now is the overview report. So there is a marketing channels left navigation menu that will have an overview report. Looks like this, side-by-side comparison of the data you get based on your rules. You will get out of the box 2 basic allocation reports that are fundamental to reporting. You'll get first touch and last touch out of the box for your metrics, and you will also note that you do get both a channel level. You saw on the slide before, we have direct, natural, paid search, all those high-level channels that we've talked about. And you'll also have a detail view, right? What are the details under natural search? In this case, we're seeing search engines that are attributable to natural search. So we can dig in deeper and understand how those search engines are behaving and participating in that natural search. So in essence, we have the overview report, and then we have 4 reports underneath that are standard ranked reports. We have channel, that's the high-level view, both first touch and last touch, and then we have the channel detail, first touch and last touch. We'll talk very specifically about how those are populated and how those can be identified specific to your organization here in just a moment. Once we go through this effort, this is what we have. What do we do with this? Again, we can evaluate the effectiveness of those campaigns, how they're contributing to conversion on your site. We can also leverage those in segmentation. If you happen to be on the new version 15 platform, we can build segments around the channels that we've identified or channel detail that we identified and apply those to our other reports. We can also apply other segments to this report. We can start looking at how maybe channel behavior changes between first-time visitors and return visitors, purchasers, those types of things. So it adds a lot of flexibility in the reporting, just getting this foundational reporting in place. So with that, I will pass it over to Brent, who will walk us through the setup, and we'll take an eventual deep dive into the channels and how we might set those up appropriately.
Thanks, Aaron. So a lot of the value that you're going to get from marketing channels, it will depend on how you set up the reports. And so this is really a 2-step process. And so the first step is to identify what your marketing channels are and add those to the report. And then the next step is then to configure rules that identify those campaigns. So looking at that first step, and Aaron talked briefly about this, but each business in each industry is going to have unique marketing channels. And so when you look at your channels, the first step is to, okay, let's step back and look at, what are the marketing channels that we have? And, you might have some of those listed on here. Most likely you do. But there might be additional channels that you're not even, that aren't even listed here that are unique to your business. And so, for example, you might have vanity URLs for offline TV ads or print ads that you would consider part of this marketing channel. And so there might be different examples like that you want to look as widely as possible to really see what are all the marketing channels that you're going to be needing or using within your business. The next consideration is the granularity that you want to have around these channels. So for example, you might have display ads that are specific to your e-commerce store, and then you might have display ads that are just at the branding level. And so what you might want to do is you might want to split apart or break apart that one display ad channel into 2 different separate channels. And so that's the other consideration as you're going through your marketing channels. Where does it make sense based on, because you take action differently on these channels or they have different ramifications for your business, where does it make sense to split apart or make these more granular marketing channels? Or in other cases, where does it make sense just to aggregate things because that's the best way to handle it. So one of the key things that when you're deciding on what your marketing channels should be is really about consistency. And so you want to be consistent. You want to make sure that the marketing channels are on the same level, more or less. And when I was growing up, the song came to mind, which one of these things is not like the other. And this is really important with your marketing channels. I saw somebody recently asked whether or not a company could use landing pages or treat landing pages as a marketing channel. Now, hopefully, you realize that this would be a bad idea, especially because you have other channels that are pointing or directing traffic into these landing pages. And if the landing pages were treated as their own marketing channel, they would actually steal credit from all of those sources that were directing people into those landing pages. So basically, you want to be careful about the marketing channels that you choose and that they're on a consistent level and that you have marketing channels, at least in terms of their format. Okay, so if you're wondering about if you're an admin user, basically you need to be an admin user to set up the marketing channels. And so if you were to go in and look at your marketing or go into the admin tools part of Adobe Analytics, and then you go into the report suite manager and edit the settings of a particular report suite, you'll see basically 5 options there under marketing channels. And so I'm going to focus on the first 2 options primarily because those are the 2 most important ones, but we'll touch upon these other ones briefly through the presentation. So if you're doing this for the first time, then you will actually get this pop-up here, which basically is an auto setup option. And our recommendation would be to use this auto setup and not skip it. Because you do have the option, there's a button at the bottom there where you can skip the auto setup. At least the reason why we recommend it is because the auto setup covers the basic marketing channels, and it can be a good starting point, even if you're going to customize the channels later on. If you've already set up your marketing channels as part of your implementation, then you won't see this screen. What you will see is something like this. And so within this is the starting point for adding all of your campaign, your marketing channels. And so if we zoom in here, you'll see that each marketing channel is essentially assigned its own unique ID. Okay? And as you add the channels, you'll basically get a warning like at the bottom here with the email marketing channel, warning me when I haven't actually assigned any rules to a particular channel. So you can create a channel or add a channel, but it doesn't really go into effect until you've added the rules and configured the rules behind it. You have the ability to change the name or rename the channel. So one recommendation might be, if you think of internal, if you're on the web analytics team, that might make sense to you, but people outside of the web analytics team might go, what the heck is internal? And so renaming it to really what it is, which is a session refresh, might help your users internally to understand what that means, and it'll basically lead to less questions. So that's kind of a best practice there, and that could also apply to any of your other channels where you want to have descriptive names for what they are. For example, direct. People may not know, direct. Maybe you want to change that to direct access, or maybe you want to change it to type bookmarked. So adding descriptive names to your channels can be helpful. The one thing you do want to be careful, though, is when you're swapping or changing the channels one for the other. For whatever reason, you might decide to swap, in this case, affiliate for paid search and paid search for affiliate. That can lead to problems because all of the historical data that you had under the old schema will still apply and now be confused with the new names. And so if you're looking at affiliate going forward, part of the old data would still be for paid search. And so that actually might throw people off. And so you want to be careful about those kinds of changes. They are possible, but you want to be aware of when those changes are made. The next option is you have the ability to override the allocation. And I won't get into this too much because I'll be touching it later on in the presentation, but one thing you want to make sure is that for direct and internal, it's recommended typically that you would want to disable the override for last touch, that setting. And I'll get into that in a little bit more. Now the rest of the settings in this aren't as critical as these first three. You have the ability to select, basically you can, on this here, you could select the breakdown within your overview report to be a classification instead of the details value. And so that one will become a little bit clearer later on. You also have the ability to upload offline data and key that as, or flag it as offline data using data sources. And you also have the ability to select different colors for each of the channels. And this is mainly for the overview report. You could select warm colors for your paid channels. You could select cooler colors for your earned media or owned media. And so you have different options that way. But that really only applies to the overview report. So one of the questions that we get a lot of the times is, why don't my marketing channels match up with data in my traffic sources or my campaign reports? Why am I seeing these discrepancies? And one of the key things to remember about the marketing channels reports is that they're unique. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of how they're unique. And this one is related to first touch. And one of the settings that you have, going back to the original screen, is there's an option to select visitor engagement expiration. And the way this works is basically from a first touch perspective, if I was to set up an EVAR with original value, which is essentially the same as first touch, I could set that for a month. And so it would run for 30 days. And I could also set up my marketing channels for 30 days. And if that visitor never came back within the 30 days, the data would be the same. However, if that visitor came back after 20 days and came back to our site, nothing would happen with the EVAR. It would still expire after the 30 days when it was first, in terms of the first touch. However, with the marketing channels, that 30 days of inactivity resets. And so you basically have now, I have 20 days of inactivity, or 20 days I'm tracking this value. And now I'm adding on another 30 days. And so I'm going to 50 days if they don't come back. And if they came back again, then that window would extend longer and longer. And so that's one way that, the marketing channels are unique from the rest of the EVAR and different kinds of reporting that you see. Now I want to cover another area where there's difference. And this is in the configuration. And so in terms of we've added our channels, and now we're going to configure the rules. And so we actually go into another part of another screen here, which is the marketing channel processing rules. And so the way that this works is, as people come in from these different channels, we have this processing rule that basically looks at the incoming traffic and determines, based on different criteria, it assigns it to a particular channel. And that criteria can be based on some of the values that Adobe automatically detects. It could be based on the hit values of people as they land on a particular page. What are the attributes of that page, or where they're coming from? And then lastly, the values that are passed into the conversion variables. And so there's a unique approach around the method of how we attribute success and these metrics back to the individual channels. And I actually, just as an aside, and this is related to this conversation, I actually grew up in New Zealand. And so in my childhood, I started out in New Zealand and grew up in Auckland and Wellington in particular. And there I am. Yes, I am. That's me at the Wellington Zoo. And yes, I am that pale. But anyways, there was a fountain called the Bucket Fountain. And this was in Wellington, and it reminds me of the unique approach that our marketing channels reports take, which is a waterfall approach. And so water begins at the top and then cascades down, and then is captured in different buckets, and then it may pass on to another bucket and down through this waterfall. And so if we look at this in terms of marketing, and as an aside, actually Elijah Woods, the actor from Lord of the Rings, actually climbed up this structure and urinated at the top of it, and so that's his claim to fame in Wellington, offending all of the Kiwis there. So we want to avoid that kind of contamination in our marketing channels reports from our data sources. So when we look at the waterfall approach and how that works, we might have these different rules that are used to identify the different sources. And so as the incoming traffic comes in, the first question is it paid search? No. Okay. Well, is it natural search? Nope. Is it email? Yes, we have a winner. And so basically the way that the marketing channels rules will work, they'll keep looking for, a match. Basically, is a criteria of a particular rule met? And then when it is, then it moves on. It basically doesn't continue through the string of rules and looking at those. And so order is really important when we look at this. And so there is an order that we recommend when we're looking at marketing reports, and that's typically to start out with the search-related channels, so paid and natural search, then moving into the campaigns that are based around tracking codes. And so having the query string parameters and different things in them, those would be the next target. Then looking at refer-based channels, so looking at social networks or affiliate or partner sites that are bringing traffic to your domain. And then lastly, looking at a bunch of other channels that act like sponges to soak up the rest of the traffic that's coming in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dive into each of these and take a closer look. Now, I mentioned the override allocation, and so let me step you through why this is important and important to consider. So if we had direct traffic coming in, or let me get to the direct example. So they come in actually through paid search, and they come to our site, and they hit our website, and then the next day they don't do anything on that visit, but they come back the next day, and that's where the direct access comes in. They're coming in through a URL. They were there the previous day, and then they come to the website, and then they purchase. Okay? And then another scenario with internal is they're again coming from paid search. They're on the website. They get a call, and that takes them away from their browsing behavior on the site. And for 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes, they're away. So that means that there's a session refresh when they come back. After they finish the call, they come back, they restart their session, and that is viewed as a session refresh. So based on overriding allocation, basically each of these would receive credit for these interactions. Now, if you disable this feature, you disable the overriding for these two features, and this is typically what a lot of customers have done, then that credit will then be given to paid search instead of a direct access or a session refresh, which are channels that aren't, they're just a part of the process of people interacting with your site. So that's a business decision you want to make if you want to turn that on or turn it off. Typically, we recommend to customers that they disable those, and by default, that's the settings that both of those are disabled on the allocation override. So before I get into specific examples, I want to go through the basic structure of the marketing channel rules. So the first thing is there's a condition statement that is created for each rule, and there are basically three main types of criteria that go into building these rules. And so first, you can leverage the Adobe detective items such as internal referrers, search detection, or first page of a visit. These are things that either the product itself or the tool actually detects, or the setting in the admin side that you're setting in terms of identifying what sites are internal to your site and which are outside of your domain or outside of your report suite, or identifying those search, when a paid search term is coming through, what are the query string parameters you're using. So you have that as an option. You also have the hit attributes, and so those could be the page URL, those could be the referring domain, those could be the query string parameter that are associated with that incoming traffic. And then lastly, it could be what values you're passing into the conversion variable. So it could be the tracking code or the EVAR, the values that are going into your EVAR variables. Probably we defer to the first two options more than the last, mainly because of the plugins or different things that could change those values. So the getVal_once plugin could interfere with or change the values that you would see between the marketing channels, and if you were using the hit attributes instead of using the query string parameter instead of the tracking code, you'd get different results there. So the next step, once you've identified the rule, is to take action on it. And so the second part of the rule is to do two things. Once you've met the criteria, then you specify what channel it is for, and then you also specify what that breakdown is that you want to have associated with the channel. So you basically specify what the channel detail is for that. Okay, so let's roll up our sleeves and get into some specific examples. So we're going to start with search, which is at the top. And basically, we leverage the paid search detection rules, and we want to know what the query string parameter is. And so in this here, you basically, that's a setting, and I've listed out where you find that if you're not familiar with it. But basically, you should have that set out of the box, or at least on implementation, should have that setting. And so here it's looking for what are the query string parameters that I use to identify paid search from natural search. And so the rule essentially uses that, and basically the natural search will just key off of that. Whatever is not paid will be natural. You also have the channel details in here, and so if you look at the default setting, it's basically search engine plus search keywords. Now I find that a little bit difficult to use, because basically you get something like this, where you get the P, which represents paid search, you get the specific search engine, which is Google, and then you get the keyword after that, which in this case is PowerPoint tips. So I have these three things together now concatenated, and I can get a lot of unique values this way, because not only am I getting the keywords, but I'm getting keywords by specific search engine, which can be a little bit overwhelming and hard to use. And so one of the great things that we have now with if you're familiar with the classification rule builder, is you can basically set up automated rules to take this value and actually break it apart into separate classifications. And so the two-step process, you would just go into the classification rule builder. You'd go into your admin tools, you'd set up the classifications that you want to create on the marketing channel. This is actually in the marketing channels menu structure. You'd set up these classifications, and then you'd go into the classification rule builder. And what I'm doing basically here is I'm keying off different values in that string, and so I'm looking at either the first character to see if it's a P or an N, and then I'm assigning it to paid search and natural search, and then I'm using a regular expression to basically parse out different parts of that thing. And so now when I'm in my reports, I can actually get options to break down the channel by keyword, or by the search engine, or by the type of search that it was. So that's what it would basically look. I would have a report that has search type with paid search, the search engines would have Google, and then the keyword would go into that last keyword classification. So I mentioned that you have the option to do granular breakdowns of each of these channels, and I want to share one example. So if I wanted to take our paid search and divide it up between branded and unbranded terms, I could go in and modify this rule. I would add another rule here, and I would click on it and basically add in the terms that I consider to be brand terms that are associated with paid search. And so each of the line items here that you see are basically OR statements. And so it could be PowerPoint Ninja, PPT Ninja, or et cetera down the list. And so I would create that rule. And then in terms of the unbranded terms, the unique thing about the waterfall approach is that the unbranded rule doesn't need to have additional logic other than the default search detection. So anything that is not branded would fall into the second rule. I don't have to identify certain terms. It's just whatever's not captured by that branded term would then fall into the unbranded. So that's where the order becomes important. You wouldn't want to have unbranded above your branded, and that's how they kind of work together. Okay, so now I'm going to look at campaigns. And so these are ones that you have query string parameters, you have tracking codes associated with them. So could be your display ads, could email, could be affiliates where you're tracking them through a tracking code. And this works slightly differently. So the way that you would do this is you would have the query string parameter, you would look for that parameter and then you might have a prefix. And there's actually two ways that you could actually look for things, you know, and it'll be unique to each business how they approach this. But basically you have one example here where maybe you have unique parameters for each of your channels. And so I might have a unique parameter for email, unique parameter for display, affiliates, etc. Or I might share the same the same parameter, tracking parameter, but within those query strings, I would actually specify with a prefix email, display, affiliate to then break it apart. Unless there's something like that to actually specify what kind of channel this is, there's no way for marketing channels to identify it without some kind of something that makes it unique. And so what you may, depending on how chaotic or complex your environment is, your marketing environment, you may want to create a catch-all rule. And so what this will do is, you know, if you have different teams that are doing things and sometimes they make mistakes, but you still want to classify it as a campaign, you might just say, does the PID exist? You know, or the parameter exist. In this case, I'm using PID. Or you might look for a bunch of different PIDs or different unique name value parameters that you're looking for there. And so then you can bucket those into a kind of a catch-all campaign bucket if needed. And you have lots of options. I haven't really mentioned this, but you have lots of options here for tailoring the rule to what you need to do. And in this case, we did exist, but there are other options there that might come in handy for the different rules that you're building. Okay, so let's move down into social networks and affiliates. This time, affiliates is based on, they're coming from a specific referring domain rather than do they have a tracking code in the landing page that they're coming to. And so in this case, if we just look at social networks, one recommendation that we have is that you audit the social network list periodically to keep it up to date and add any industry-specific or local media sites that you may know of. Right out of the box, the one thing you will want to look at, if any of these are relevant to you, and probably some of them are, Pinterest is not on that list. The shortening URL for Twitter is not on that list, t.co. Foursquare is not in that list, and there's also another prominent YouTube URL that's not on that default list. And so go through that list, make sure you audit it, and make sure it's up to date. The other thing that you'll notice is there's actually an issue with plus.google.com, which is your Google Plus data. This has actually got two issues. One is that this is an old URL for Google Plus, which they don't really use anymore. And secondly, there's actually a disconnect here between, if you look on the left, you see referring root domain. And so referring root domain would only be limited to, it wouldn't capture the subdomain of the plus.google.com. And so you actually have in your menu structure here, you have a bunch of different options here for capturing different parts of the query string, or sorry, of the referrer. And so here you have the entire refer option, you have the referring domain or the referring domain and path, you have the root domain, or you have the referring parameter. And so depending on what you're looking at, what you're trying to capture, you can use those different parts to target what you need. And so in this case, the challenge is that we need to have it as a referring domain, and there's the domain that we need it to look for. And so if you have Google Plus, and this is probably a growing area of traffic to your site, you want to add an additional rule. And the other thing you'll notice at the top left, I've changed it from all of the following are true to any of the following are true. And so that'll capture this this additional rule for the Google Plus traffic. Another thing in terms of referring domain, another option that you have, and there's lots of options here. You know, you may have traffic from specific referring domains that is important to you as channels. In this case here, if you wanted to separate out, say, the web-based email providers, you know, you would create a list of some of these mail providers, and then you could identify them using kind of more of a referring domain approach. So now what we're going to do is get into the last area, and basically you've got your stack of rules here, and at the bottom you have the no channel identified bucket. And so you want to keep this bucket as empty as possible because that's really traffic that's not being categorized into any of the channels. And so these last few words, or these last few rules, act as sponges that soak up the leftover traffic, and I'll drill into each one of these. So if we look at this one here, which is the internal, the session refresh or the internal rule, it is dependent on a couple of things. One is this internal URL filter, which should be created when you have a new report suite created. You want to identify which sites or domains are a part of this report suite and which are viewed as external sites. And then the other part of this rule is identifying that it's the first page of a visit. And so there are some different situations where you'll run into the session refresh. In fact, we've got 4 here. So one is the timeout. They're on the site, they walk away from the computer, they come back, there's a timeout. That'll appear as a session refresh. If there's some kind of URL redirect that occurs and the referrer is lost, that'll look like it's a session refresh. If the visitor is on a page that is not tagged within your site and then move to a page that is tagged, that'll be viewed as a session refresh. And then if you have a multi-suite tagging environment where you have a global report suite and then secondary report suites, at the secondary level, as people move from one site to the other, they'll also be viewed as a session refresh. So this one is the one that probably people like the least. It's because it's really your mystery traffic. This is where you don't know anything about the visitors in terms of referrer information or a query string parameter. And so a lot of times, we call this the type bookmarked segment of visitors or traffic. And that's only because, a lot of people may come that way if they type in the URL of your website directly, or if they bookmarked your site without any query string parameters in that bookmark, then they'll be viewed as a direct traffic. But it's also possible, that traffic, this traffic could have had the referrer or the query string parameter stripped somehow. And so it's important to monitor this group and make sure that there's nothing, if you see it spike up over a short period of time, there may be something that's driving that. Then lastly, this is the bottom of the end of the line, so to speak. This is the last chance for us to categorize something. And so it's a very simple rule if this referring domain is not empty. And so what you'll see here is it's a good idea to monitor this with the detail breakdown to see if there's not significant levels of traffic that are going into this catch-all that should be, coming from one of the other channels. And so this is one that you'd want to measure or monitor over time to make sure that there's nothing relevant in it that would be critical or major to, consider for changing one of the other channel rules to incorporate that data. So once you have your marketing channel set up, there's lots of things you can do with the reports. You also have the option to upload cost data into the marketing channels reports on a fixed or variable basis. You have, as I mentioned and gave the examples in the paid search example, you have classifications that you can classify the channel detail information to be more helpful or organize it or break it down in different ways. And then on the other side, as Aaron was talking about, you have the ability in Reports and Analytics or SiteCatalyst or Discover to do the breakdowns across these different variables, to create segments, to bring this data into dashboards or into Report Builder. You also have the ability to export it out to through data extracts or data warehouse or APIs. So one of the things, before we end this call, we just want to give you some highlight some key takeaways to remember as you're doing this. So one is that order is really important when it comes to the marketing channels. If you place a channel too low or too high in the order, it will actually affect how much credit it receives. And also, in terms of the logic, in the example of unbranded, if you put unbranded before branded on the search terms, you would actually, it could impact the data. And so the order of the different rules is really important. Now, second thing is to carefully consider the rule settings. So as I've shown, simple mistakes and oversights can easily break a rule or create unintended results. So for example, instead of using, if I had multiple rules, if I have this applies to all of the following rules as opposed to any of the following rules, that will change the data that's assigned to that channel. Also, if I used a referring root domain instead of a referring domain, that could also have an effect. So you need to be aware of how these rules, how the settings and how the things work together. The challenge that you have is that with, even though the marketing channels are great, there is no debugging tool that you have that will inform you how these rules are being set on a page. So today you could use the debugger tool, go onto a page, see how the variables are set. You don't have that option with marketing channels. It's not going to tell you what marketing channel this particular, your visit to the site which bucket it will go into. And you also don't have a test environment. And so you can't test the rules beforehand before you run them. So it's important to validate your rules before you turn them on. It's important to inspect the rules after launching them to make sure that you didn't miss anything major that breaks your rules. The next thing is that we recommend that you don't just set and forget your rules. The web is a dynamic environment that is constantly changing and evolving, and so we recommend that you review your rules periodically to make sure that they're optimized to your business needs. And the great thing about the marketing channel reports is that you have control. I mean, you can react at your own speed. You don't have to wait for Adobe. You don't have to wait for implementation consultant. I mean, most of the things that you can change, you can do within the rules that you create, and you can make those modifications on the fly. Changes are not retroactive. This is just something we want to emphasize, that any changes that are made to the rules apply to the new traffic going forward. They don't apply historically to the past traffic. And so it's important as you make significant changes to your marketing channel rules, make sure you keep track of when you made those changes. Because if you're doing a year-over-year analysis and you forget when something changed significantly, that could actually impact your analysis. And so you want to keep track of what those are. And then lastly, the tendency, it's very tempting to compare the reports, compare the marketing channel report against the traffic sources reports or against the EVAR reports that you may have. But you have to realize that, that these are very different, and both from a first touch and a last touch perspective. From a first touch perspective, there's that 30 days of rolling in activity that is unique to the marketing channels. And then on the last touch basis, you have the other channel reports, such as traffic sources, are not holistic. And so unlike the marketing channels, they're going to credit more success to different values within those reports because they're not holistic. They don't have to share the credit with the other marketing channels. And so be careful about the comparisons that you make between the marketing channel reports and these other channel reports that Aaron covered off at the beginning of this call. And that is it. Well, thank you for joining this call. We're hopeful that it was helpful to you and that you got some insights and some tips that will help you in improving your marketing channels or taking advantage of the marketing channels if you haven't been using them previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you to our participants. We appreciate you joining today. If we do still have a few minutes that